In Italy, there's this one family that controls Ferrari, Jeep, Chrysler, Maserati, and The Economist. They also own a soccer team worth over $2 billion, and they control Italy's largest bank. The Agnellis have more power than most governments do. They control 30% of Italy's stock market, employing over 360,000 people worldwide. But most people have never heard their name. They're not just Italy's Rockefellers. They're the family that literally decides if Italy's economy grows or crashes. And here's the wild part. They got this power by playing every side. Fascists, allies, communists, whoever was winning at the time. So, buckle in. This is the wild story of how one family decides the fate of Italy. In Italy, power rarely changes hands because it passes down bloodlines from palaces to boardrooms. A few families have always pulled the strings behind the scenes, like the Benettins in infrastructure, the Pirellis in industry, and the Berlusconis in media, but none of them can match up to the Agnellis. They're basically Italy's industrial royalty, and they've built or taken over the country's most recognized companies, shaped the country's culture, and turned business into power. When discussing the Agnellis, everything begins with Fiat. This car factory became Italy's heartbeat, helping it rise into an industrial powerhouse. And through Fiat, the Agnellis pretty much have left their fingerprints on every part of Italian life. At their peak, Gianni Agnelli's companies alone were responsible for almost 8% of Italy's entire GDP. His reach was so wide that government policies often moved in sync with Fiat's business interests. But before the Agnellis became the face of Italian capitalism, they were just a small family in Turin with one big, bold idea: to build cars for a country that barely had roads. By the way, please do subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Alright, back to the video. The year was 1899, and Italy was still finding its feet as a new nation. The north was industrializing fast, but still, much of the country remained rural and poor. That's where Giovanni Agnelli showed up, a man with a military past and a talent for spotting opportunities where others saw chaos. While most were stuck in the past, Agnelli was already thinking about engines, speed, and industry. Together with a small group of investors, he founded Fabbrica Italiana Automobili Torino, or Fiat for short. By 1900, the first factory opened. Agnelli took command as managing director and oversaw 35 workers who built 24 cars that year. Now I know that sounds really small, but back then that was actually groundbreaking because cars were still a foreign idea in Italy at the time. Because there were no roads built for them, there was no market waiting. Agnelli basically created the industry from scratch, an industry that would become the foundation of his family's empire. By 1904, production had grown fivefold, and by 1906, Fiat was making over 1,100 cars. And he had already opened a dealership in New York City before most Italians even owned a car. That same year, Fiat became a corporation. What is remarkable is that Giovanni had started as a junior partner and managed to take full control of the company. He began buying up critical patents and introduced modern production methods. These included early assembly line systems and precision engine tooling that put Fiat ahead of its time. But success rarely comes without a crack in the foundation, because in 1908, Fiat faced its first real reckoning. It was the time that Fiat was rocked by a major financial scandal. Rumors spread about falsified accounts and inflated share prices. The entire board was forced to resign. Giovanni Agnelli was dragged to court, accused of manipulating stock prices for profit. The prosecutors failed to prove it, but Agnelli walked free. Still, the scandal left a pretty big mark on their reputation. That brush with disaster changed him. Agnelli became more strategic, less trusting, and far more calculated in whom he trusted. So when World War I broke out a few years later, Agnelli didn't hesitate to take advantage and secure his company's future. He'd already been through public humiliation, courtroom battles, and near collapse. So he moved fast and secured military contracts, scaled production, and turned Fiat's factories into the engine of Italy's war effort. By tying his company to the country's security, he ensured the security of his own business. Literally, Fiat's factories shifted overnight into wartime production. Its factories in Turin ran day and night to supply Italy's military with anything that they needed. I'm talking about trucks, tanks, airplanes, tractors, even diesel engines. By the time the war was in full swing, Fiat had over 30,000 workers to fuel the war effort. But here's the thing, the profits were staggering. And behind the numbers, the accusations were louder. Critics targeted Fiat for war profiteering. Agnelli knew that he needed to cover, so he turned to politics and found one of the most dangerous allies of his time. Benito Mussolini. He was a rising firebrand of Italian nationalism. In 1914, Agnelli decided to fund Mussolini's political movement, and when Fiat came under fire for the huge profits made during the war, Mussolini repaid the favor by just erasing the company's record. And sure enough, the alliance paid off beyond expectation. By the late 1930s, Fiat had over 50,000 workers that dominated Italy's industrial world. Once World War II erupted, those same assembly lines shifted from cars again to tanks, trucks, and aircraft engines for Mussolini's army. When Italy sided with Nazi Germany, Fiat kept the supply chain moving for them as well. But soon, the war was turning against Italy. Giovanni quickly shifted tone accordingly. He started voicing sympathy for the Allies, seeing which way history was moving. It was pure survival and an attempt to save Fiat and the family name from post-war reckoning. But despite this, Italian authorities temporarily seized Agnelli's assets for fascist collaboration in 1945. But the punishment was pretty short-lived. Fiat was way too vital for Italy's economy to dismantle, and the family's connections helped them survive accountability. That survival opened the door for a new face of the dynasty. After the war, the empire passed down to a new generation. Giovanni's grandson, Gianni Agnelli, took charge in 1945. Gianni was sharp and ambitious. He knew power had to be earned and then controlled. By 1963, he became the managing director. And just 3 years later, he was chairman and CEO, basically the most powerful industrialist in Western Europe. And to be fair, he earned that reputation. Gianni helped drag Italy out of the ruins of war and into the modern age. He wasn't afraid to cross boundaries, literally. In the middle of the Cold War, he partnered with the Soviet Union in a deal that rewarded his company handsomely. Together, they built a factory capable of producing more than 500,000 cars a year. This way, he proved that profit could outpace ideology. And that mindset took Fiat global. Fiat's logo was now stamped on factories from Moscow to Sao Paulo. Under Agnelli, Fiat absorbed Italy's greatest car names like Ferrari, Alfa Romeo, Lancia, and Maserati. And to no one's surprise, he turned Fiat into an empire that defined Italian engineering. By his final years, Fiat had won 7 European Cars of the Year award and had over 200,000 people working under him. That kind of scale and prestige gave the company enormous weight in Italy's economy. 1 in every 5 Italians working in manufacturing had some kind of link to Fiat or its suppliers. Entire towns in Turin, Mirafiori, or Pomigliano revolved around its production lines. A job in Fiat meant stability, status, and belonging to Italy's post-war recovery. But Agnelli wasn't finished expanding his reach. He set his sights on France. He had his eyes on Citroën, Europe's second largest automaker and a crown jewel of French industry. Agnelli personally led the talks. He worked through his old friends, the Michelin family. They were owners of Citroën and France's largest tire empire, as you probably know. Everyone knew the stakes. If he pulled it off, then Fiat would have ruled the continent's roads. The negotiations were moving fast and the Michelin family seemed ready to sign. But then politics stepped in. Because French President Charles de Gaulle blocked the deal himself. He feared Italian control over a national icon. Fiat was forced to settle for a 15% stake only. The Citroën setback taught Agnelli an uncomfortable truth, and that was economic power had its limits. You could own factories, hire tens of thousands of employees, and still lose to a single political decision. From that moment on, the Agnellis began to understand that control over narratives and what people read and believed mattered as much as control over machines or money. If you had people's support, even iron-willed politicians would be hard-pressed to oppose you for fear of losing their elections. So, their influence moved from factory to the front page. Gianni Agnelli opened the door to media influence, and years later, his grandson made it global, John Elkann. Now, Gianni had once owned La Stampa, his home newspaper. John followed in his footsteps, but on a much greater scale. The Agnellis took a pivotal turn when Exor, their holding company, acquired 43.7% stake in GEDI or Jedi. This was Italy's largest media group. The deal was worth over 102 million euros. The shares came straight from CIR, the holding company of the De Benedetti family. Now, this was a dynasty that had long mixed business with politics. Carlo De Benedetti was one of Italy's most influential industrialists and a vocal figure in center-left politics. For decades, his newspapers backed progressive agendas and shaped public debate in Rome and beyond. So, GEDI or Jedi had long been tied with the De Benedetti family. This way, the Agnellis were effectively taking control of the country's narrative from one power circle to basically another. The media portfolio the Agnelli now had was now massive, because together, the family now controlled La Repubblica, La Stampa, 13 regional newspapers, and even airwaves with Radio DJ. This gave the Agnellis reach into regional narratives beyond national headlines. But the Agnellis didn't really stop at news media. In 2015, Exor, the holding company again, acquired 43.4% of the Economist Group. This way, it gained influence over one of the world's best-known international weeklies. Now, The Economist carries real influence, as you know, because reporting directly feeds into decision-making circles. Its coverage guides investors on markets, it helps policymakers gauge global sentiment, and frames debates that ripple through boardrooms and ministries. So now the Agnellis found a way to project their voice well beyond Italy through that platform. Simply put, the media holdings help the company influence public views, which stories are emphasized, which voices are amplified, and which political narratives are normalized. Much like Murdoch's empire in the UK or the Rothschilds' command over the financial press, the Agnellis have effectively mastered power through perception. But influence through headlines was never enough. While the Agnellis were quietly shaping what people read, they've been plotting influence on an even bigger scale, the corridors of European power itself. In 1983, Umberto Agnelli helped create the European Roundtable of Industrialists. This was an elite and influential lobby that linked corporate power to Brussels decision-makers. It was the first real sign that Fiat's ambitions extended beyond cars towards shaping the rules of Europe's markets themselves. 3 decades later, that transition became official. In 2016, the family's holding company moved its legal and fiscal base to the Netherlands. Officially, Exor said that the move was about a simpler corporate structure and growing international profile. In real terms, it meant that the company wanted fewer legal hurdles, more control over its decision-making, and the flexibility to operate as a global business rather than being tied to Italy's strict corporate rules. It turned Exor from an Italian powerhouse to a European holding giant with the freedom to move capital wherever the opportunity called. The consequences of that decision surfaced 8 years later in the form of global stakes. By 2024, Exor owned 10.1% of Clarivate. This is a New York-listed data and analytics company that guides decisions for universities, corporations, and governments. That stake could soon rise to 17%, giving Exor even more influence over one of the world's major data firms. In an age where data shapes everything from stock prices to policy, the Agnellis have placed themselves right where information becomes power and profit. In other words, the family has access to data that guides investment flows, research priorities, and market valuations before it becomes public knowledge. This gives them an advantage in spotting profitable sectors early, whether it's pharmaceuticals, artificial intelligence, or patent markets. They can anticipate where funding, innovation, and regulation are heading and position their portfolio to benefit them first. And they have been strategic in where they invest. By owning parts of firms in sectors like health tech, energy, and industrials, they have gained quite a leverage on Europe's most sensitive policy debates. I mean, they hold stakes in companies that shape how Europe tracks information, funds clean energy, and builds new industries. It's the kind of influence that doesn't just show up in headlines, it shapes the world around them. Now, true influence isn't just built on industries or assets, it's built on what shapes minds and emotions, and that's where the Agnellis made one of their most strategic moves, into culture itself. Because when you own what people love, you don't need to own anything else, and the Agnellis knew that power built on emotions lasts much longer than profit. Their entry into cultural influence began early. This was back in 1923, when Edoardo Agnelli became the president of Juventus. Football united the country from north to south, rich to poor. With each victory, the Agnellis claimed loyalty and admiration across social classes. This placed the family at the center of Italian pride. Each successor, from Gianni to Umberto to Andrea, carried that bond forward. Juventus's trophies became a reflection of family dominance. Victories on the field reinforced authority off it. Decades later, the family aimed to capture another national obsession: Ferrari. In 1969, Fiat bought 50% of the company. That gave the Agnellis influence over both the working class and the elite. Fiat built mobility, but Ferrari built luxury. Over time, Fiat deepened its control. By 1988, it had acquired 90% of Ferrari, including the shares once held by Enzo Ferrari himself. Decades later, Ferrari went public, and the IPO proved that real power still rested in Turin. The listing drew enormous attention, not for its numbers, but for what it symbolized. Ferrari had become more than a car brand. It was prestige, exclusivity, and craftsmanship distilled into one name. And that halo extended over to the Agnellis. Their reputation became tied to the same qualities. Design, success, perfection, all that good stuff. With Exor and a deal with Piero Ferrari, the family secured 48.1% of the votes at Ferrari. They no longer needed full ownership. Authority was baked into the structure. Even in sports, their reach was cultural. Juventus's golden years from 1980s to the 2010s ran parallel to Fiat's industrial peak. On the field and in the factory, victories carried the same signature. Look, they conquered Italy's passions, and the next step was naturally to conquer Europe's rules. By now you've seen that John Elkann carried the family legacy into the modern era, right? But to most people he looks calm and even distant from politics. But behind closed doors, very few major industrial moves in Europe ever happen without brushing past his reach. As the head of Exor, Elkann controls a 40 billion euro empire that stretches from Milan to Amsterdam and beyond. But money isn't the full story. Power now comes from being in the rooms where Europe's rules are written, and the Agnellis move through Europe's elite class. Businesses and roundtables, think tanks and foundations. These are places where CEOs, politicians, and regulators talk policy long before they become law. Elkann learned well from the families like the Wallenbergs and the Pritzkers. Their example taught him how to turn family wealth into real influence and how to use networks to keep the Agnellis embedded within Europe's power structure. He borrowed ideas, built networks, and positioned the Agnellis at the heart of Europe's decision-making world. Through these circles, they help influence EU policy on green tech, mobility, and industrial competitiveness to this day. Ultimately, the Agnellis show how far vision and patience can really reach. From Turin to Brussels, their moves extend well beyond cars and sports. They define narratives, industries, and influence. The truth is, in a continent still ruled by old money and quiet alliances, the Agnellis remain one of the few families that turned a national legacy into a continental power. The Agnellis have shifted from building cars to shaping information, policy, and markets. They've outlasted monarchies, dictators, and political shifts without ever needing a public office. So that begs the question, is Europe really built on democracy? Or thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you soon.